I live in an apartment complex with my husband and 13-month-old baby in a bad area of my city. Last night, my husband was at work, as he works until 11 p.m. most days, and I kept hearing strange noises coming from my balcony. I turned the porch light on, expecting to see a stranger with a toothy grin and a knife in his hand. Instead, I saw nobody and went back to do what I was doing. Again, I heard a strange noise and nervously checked. Nobody. Nothing. I thought to myself that if it was just my neighbors outside, then I was probably weirding them out by opening my slider door, turning the light on, turning it off, and turning it back on. So I came back inside and shoved some headphones into my ear holes so that I would stop frightening myself. This worked beautifully, and I forgot all about the noises I heard. Typically at around 9:30 or so, I take a hot and relaxing bath to prepare my mind for slumber. I got caught up on something on the interwebs though, and I ended up not getting up from my kitchen right before 10 p.m. Around the time I arose to bathe, I heard a pounding outside my apartment door. I glanced out my apartment's peephole and saw no one. I could only see one other apartment, as there are 4 on my floor, out of the peephole. And since I am nosy, I decided to wait until maybe I could see this person. They were really pounding on the door quite hard, and it was shaking the apartment door. After probably 8 minutes or so, the pounding stopped. I waited. Still no one. The neighbors hadn't answered their door yet either, as you can hear everything through these doors. The silence continued for maybe 5 more minutes, and a couple of minutes after I walked away, it started again. This time though, it sounded like it was on my own door. Now, I'm a very anxious person, and I do not like being alone in my apartment at night, and refuse to open the door if I don't absolutely have to at night. So I cautiously looked through my peephole and saw absolutely nothing. This terrified me. I messaged my husband and he told me to call our building's security. The pounding got louder and louder, and then it stopped for several minutes, and then abruptly continued. This went on for some time. I stared out my door's peephole, wondering what the hell was going on, as I tried to rationalize what was happening. Maybe someone actually is knocking on the neighbor's door, and it just sounds like they're knocking on mine. Maybe someone's locked outside and is pounding on that door. Then my thoughts were disrupted as someone began to scratch at my door. My apartment door is metal, so I could distinctly hear the sound of a person's nails running across it. I glanced out the peephole, terrified as to what creepy creature I might discover. Again, no human in sight. I then decided that I should go to my closet in my bedroom and call security, away from the front door and far enough away from my baby's bedroom so that she couldn't hear me. But right as I'm about to walk away, I saw something through the peephole that made me audibly gasp. I saw a man slowly stand up. I had never seen him before. I couldn't see him prior to his standing, because the peephole doesn't see that far down. I'm pretty sure that he was crouching down and waiting for me to open my door to see what the hell was happening, and then do who knows what. So I'm glad that I didn't open my door. First off, the man looked pretty normal. If I saw him, and he wasn't standing up, crouching near my door, I wouldn't have taken a second glance at him. I couldn't really tell his height or eye colour. The peephole kind of distorts everything. He was white and had brown hair. His facial expression was very calm, but it seemed like the kind of calm that you witness when someone is about to lose their mind. I don't know. It's hard to explain. Just so that you're aware, by the way, my apartment is directly in front of the stairs and the locked door that leads outside, as people have to buzz their apartment of choice to get in without keys. So I have a very clear view of the main front door and the apartment to my left. I cannot see the other two apartments on my right and the stairs leading to the third and final floor. Anyway, after the man got up, he went down the stairs, but he did not exit the building. He turned around the corner, probably to attempt to creep out some other folks, although I heard no more additional pounding. So maybe he lives down there, or was staying someone who lives down there. I shakily called the police after he left. They came into my apartment and filed a report. They didn't really seem to care much though. I'm sure they get a ton of calls from people in my crappy neighborhood. At least I made a report though, right? It was very difficult for me to sleep that night. I sleep with my back to the open window and wear earplugs. I know it's weird. They were a necessity when I was a teenager and had a drunk father come home at 2 a.m. when I needed to wake up for 6 a.m. for school. So now I can't sleep without them. And I kept imagining someone somehow breaking through the window and slicing my throat, and my husband wouldn't hear me because he was in the living room with a handset playing Destiny. Nothing out of the ordinary happened that night though. Last night, I was afraid that I would hear it again, and as I was about to get into the bathtub, I did hear knocking. It startled me at first, but then I heard one of my neighbours yelling in Spanish. I couldn't understand him, but I'm pretty sure the poor guy got locked out by his young daughter. So I guess this ends up being rather boring, which is good. My husband immediately brought a dowel to stick in our slider, and we also brought one of those really overpriced sticks that you put under your doorknob for extra protection. And here is my number one question. Besides what the hell this weirdo was doing crouching and knocking, why didn't any of my neighbours hear him? It wasn't even 10 o'clock at the time. That incident seriously unnerved me, but it didn't end there. So about 1.5 weeks ago, I snatched up my baby and we had plans to go to the store to buy a couple of things. When I got outside of my apartment building, there was a woman crying almost directly in front of it. I gave her a look of sympathy to sort of say, "I hope you're alright," without prying into her business. Then I noticed the man who was standing next to her and holding her shoulder. I probably gave him the strangest look, but I was 99.7% sure that it was the man who had been knocking and scratching at my door a week or so earlier. The woman he was holding was my neighbour, who lives directly beneath me, apartment number 4. There are a lot of people that visit and possibly live in that apartment, and I reckon I hadn't seen him before, or maybe he was her new boyfriend or something. Anyway, I found the man. I was certain of it. He looked fairly normal too. I walked to my car, and as soon as I noticed the police cars in the parking lot, there were about 7 or 8 of them scattered around. I wondered what the hell had happened. I really wanted to stick around and watch this shit show unfold, but I didn't know if this is true for every neighborhood. Growing up in the hood, if any sort of fire truck, ambulance, or police cars were going to be seen at houses or a house, the entire neighborhood would walk down the block to stand around and gawk. I understand this behavior, but it annoys me an unbelievable amount, so I drove away. When I returned about an hour and a half later, the police were still there. I assumed the whole thing was about a break-in, or maybe the neighbour had a lot of pot in their apartment or something. Eventually, I just forgot about it. So I go on living and hope that I don't see this man at my door or near my apartment or outside. And I don't. Life is good. And then last week Monday, the 6th. The only reason that I remember the date is because this was the first time that I took my younger sister to donate plasma, and I had set up the appointment. I brought my sister and niece back to my apartment to hang out for a bit. As I was going up my stairs, I immediately noticed a truly awful smell that made me instantly gag. Now, I have a very strong stomach. I don't usually gag over smells. Years ago I worked maintenance at a grocery store and had to clean out the 8-ish foot long dairy drain. If you don't know what year-old rotten milk smells like, it smells exactly like the biggest puddle of diarrhea wrapped in a giant turd. I gagged, and then entirely joking, I told my sister that someone must be cooking meth in their crappy little apartment. Now I don't know what someone cooking meth smells like. I was more of a pot, shrooms and LSD kind of gal back in the day, but it smelt like burnt plastic or rubber and had a very strong chemical odour to it. It was exceedingly harsh smelling. In retrospect, I probably should have called the police, but I didn't think much of it and wouldn't have known what to say. "Hey cop that I am speaking to on this cellular telephone device, what the heck is the aroma of cooking meth?" Anyway, yesterday my husband wakes up and there's a Facebook message on his phone from a friend of his. It's a voice recording that she sent him. "Bro, there are 5, 6, 7 cop cars outside your apartment. What is going on?" Yeah, looks like they're checking out the apartment underneath you, like..." "Ma'am, what's going on?" Very eloquently said. Anyhow, she sent that message at around 3 AM. After he responded to the message later that day, she mentioned that the cops were busting through their windows and whatnot, as they're on the first floor. Now, this would have been happening right beneath our bedroom window and/or our baby bedroom window, and we heard absolutely nothing. Because we are nosy humans, my husband asked his friend from work, who lives a couple of apartments down from them, if he knew anything about it. It turns out that he did, in fact. The friend said that the cops were there because they had a meth lab in their apartment, and they had been cooking meth for some time. I know that this is just hearsay and all, as the friend heard it from someone else, but I am convinced that the man who was lurking around my apartment was on meth, and maybe that's why he was acting like that. He didn't really seem to be on drugs to me though, but as I previously stated, I have never been around anyone on meth. Does the smell of it cooking smell like chemically plastic? That is just the worst description ever. Would a person on meth act how he did? Or am I just jumping to conclusions? Also, why would the cops have been there the first time? I saw the police go into their apartment, and no one was arrested that I could tell. They wouldn't have just let someone off the hook if they found meth supplies used to manufacture meth inside of their apartment. Any speculations are welcome. My first day moving into student halls, I was greeted by a very friendly guy named Dominic. He was very camp and obviously gay, but I didn't have a problem with that. He offered to help me unpack in my room, then go for a drink with me. Although I thought he was a little too overfamiliar, I was delighted that I had made a friend so quickly and accepted his offer. He put a tremendous amount of effort into helping me put everything in the appropriate place in my room. We then went for a drink at a student bar. I made a point to tell him I was straight, as I suspected he may have a bit of a crush on me, hence why he was being so nice. However, he didn't show any signs of dismay and continued chatting to me. I liked him a lot. He was very intelligent and interesting to talk to, and I was very pleased that I had a new friend already. I was worried that I'd be lonely in the uni dorms. He didn't live in the same building as me. He lived just across. I was studying creative writing, and he was studying business. But we started to hang out a lot. Although I liked Dominic, I did start to find him a little overbearing. He would send me texts and messages on Facebook all the time, and would get upset if I didn't reply, even if it only was about 5 minutes. He would always want to know what I was doing, and if I disappeared off Facebook for a while, he would want to know where I'd been all day. One time, I even sent him a text mentioning I was on a train, and he texted back, "Why are you on a train? Why am I not invited to wherever you're going?" I was on my way to my part-time job. I made quite a few other friends, and he would always show visible signs of displeasure whenever they were around and whenever I talked to him about them. He would tell me he disliked them and that I shouldn't trust them. He was very possessive, and I personally can't stand clingy friends, so I tried to distance myself from him a bit, but the more I pulled away, the tighter he held. I still hung out with him and still cared about him, but I was starting to worry about where this friendship was going. I was pretty sure this guy had a crush on me, and soon my suspicions were confirmed. I met this girl at a party called Anna and asked her out on a date. She accepted. I was really thrilled and told Dominic about it. The second I told him, his face fell. "Why are you going on a date with a girl?" he asked me, sounding very worried. 'Cause I want to? But I'm gonna be jealous. Please don't go. It'll really hurt me. You wouldn't want to hurt me. I'm your best friend. I had never actually told him he was my best friend before, and I found the way he was acting now both annoying and a little creepy. "I'm sorry, but I told you I was straight before, Dominic. We can still be friends, but I'm not going to stop dating just for you." He remained sulky and miserable for the rest of the night. I told myself that he'd have to accept it and get over it soon. But when I was on the date with Anna, I kept getting phone calls from unknown numbers. I answered at first, but I couldn't hear anything on the other end. It was just as though someone was listening. I started to ignore the calls, but you would not believe how frequently they were coming in. They started coming in non-stop, and I couldn't even tell the time because they would seriously not stop. I had to put my phone on airplane mode, and after about an hour of my phone on airplane mode, I switched it off. The very second I did this, the calls came in again. Although I was unnerved, I enjoyed my date with Anna, and we agreed to meet up again. When I got home from the date, Dominic was waiting right outside my dorm, his phone in hand. "How was your date? Did you like her?" he asked, sounding miserable. "Yeah, I do." "Why did you keep calling me? Was that you?" "No." He was obviously lying. "But anyway, I've been waiting to tell you, I hear she's a massive slut. She keeps sleeping around with loads of guys. You should stay away. She'll break your heart." Anna had no mutual connections with Dominic, so I asked him how he could possibly know about this. He just told me he'd done his research. I was angered and told him it was none of his business, and that I'd find out for myself. He started crying, saying how he was just worried about me, and stormed off. I think he was hoping I'd follow him, but I didn't, and went to my room, angry, that he would try and interfere with my life like this. I have had unrequited crushes on friends before, but they don't feel the same, and I never try to force it. But Dominic only got worse. When I got back to my student room, Dominic had sent me screenshots on Facebook of a conversation he had allegedly had with Anna. The messages showed her boasting to him about how she used me and how she was planning to break my heart. Obviously, this didn't ring at all true. As one, how would she even know who Dominic was? And why would she message him? And two, why would she tell a friend of mine so openly what her plans were for me, when he would obviously just show me? I demanded that he show me the conversation from Anna on his computer screen with me there, but he told me that he had deleted the conversations because they were too upsetting for him to read. I knew right there and then that Dominic was deliberately trying to ruin my relationship with Anna through incredibly deceitful and despicable means, and I told him I wasn't interested in him, that I never would be, and that he better stop right now. He told me that I was being a terrible friend, that all he was doing was trying to look out for me, and he couldn't believe that I was believing a stranger over him. I was seriously pissed off with the way he was acting so selfish and trying to manipulate me now, and I blocked him off social media. He started sending me texts constantly, calling me non-stop, and telling me things like he was so depressed over me, and that he had started taking heroin and was contemplating suicide. Basically, trying to make me worry. He would also constantly send me texts saying how he knew Anna was cheating on me. Me and her started dating properly, and that I had to come to my senses. He was creeping me out so much that I went to stay with my parents for a bit, as I wasn't comfortable living in the same area as him. I had to block his number because the phone calls were constant. People from my uni dorm were sending me angry messages because Dominic had told them a really twisted version of what was going on, making them think Anna was a dirty STD-ridden whore who I had betrayed for him. It then turned out that he had been lying to everyone, telling them that me and him were in a romantic, sexual relationship, and that I had cheated on him with Anna, then left him for her. I furiously set everyone straight, told them that I had never been in a relationship with Dominic, and that everything he told them about Anna was bullshit. Most people believed me, although it took a while to convince everyone that Dominic was a liar. He was very manipulative, and although a lot of his lies were ludicrous, he was very good at making himself sound legit. I decided to go back to my uni dorm after a while, as it was inconvenient for me to stay at my parents' while at uni, as their house was very far from it. I arrived back there quite late, as I really didn't want to run into him. I was so angry about him. I had a new girlfriend and studies to think about. Yet, because of his obsession and harassment, he was now all I could think about. In a very twisted way, I think this is what he wanted. Positively or negatively, he wanted me thinking about him. When I got back, I lay down on my bed, thinking about what to do, when suddenly a brick came flying through my window. I jumped a mile and rolled over the side of my bed, hiding there for a moment, thinking it was burglars coming in or something. But nothing more happened. Once I got over the shock, I cautiously stepped over the broken glass and tried to look out the window when I got a phone call off a number I didn't recognize. I answered it. It was Dominic, and you won't believe what he said. "I just saw Anna throw a brick through your window and run. I told you she was bad news. You should have listened to me." You would not believe the rage I felt. I was so angry I couldn't even speak for a moment, but then I just exploded. I screamed at him that I knew it was him, and I was calling the police right now. He tried to protest, but I hung up on him and immediately called them. When they arrived, Dominic wasn't in his room, but when it was opened up, a large stash of illegal drugs was found. The manager of my student halls assured me that he'd be getting kicked out for this, and the police said that they would be getting in touch with him. After this, I never saw Dominic again. I changed my phone number and never unblocked him on social media. A couple of times I was tempted to out of sheer curiosity, but decided it wasn't worth it. I think he dropped out, because I don't know exactly what happened to him. My relationship with Anna didn't last. She was never quite clear on why she ended it, but I actually suspect that Dominic's freakish behavior scared her off, even though it wasn't my fault. Ah well, life goes on. Dominic, I hope whatever issues you're going through, you sort them out, and I hope you find a guy who actually does want to be with you. But please, let's never meet again. In the spring of 2007, I was a man living alone in an apartment complex on the bottom floor of a 2-story building. I'd been living there for 2 years, with no incidents worth mentioning, when a couple of guys in their 20s moved into an apartment upstairs. Occasionally there would be loud arguments going on in their unit, but nothing I paid much attention to at first. One night, I was up late at around 10:30. There was a dumpster just across the parking lot from my door, and I took some trash out to it. As I walked back to my place, I was vaguely aware that one of the new tenants was standing out on the upper landing, but I thought nothing of it. In hindsight, his roommate must have just been out there for the night. So, it was just this one guy by himself getting drunk. After I got in and shut my door, there was a knock. Not being paranoid at that point, I opened up. Standing there was the guy I'd just passed beneath. He had a half-consumed 40-ounce bottle of malt liquor cradled in his arms like a baby. I had the impression he'd been drinking directly from that bottle, but whatever the case, he wasn't sober. Of course, I did not invite him in. He introduced himself and started chatting away as if he'd been just a friendly new neighbour stopping by in the middle of the day to get acquainted. As he talked, he was stroking his bottle, like it was a cat or something, giggling like girls do. If this wasn't creepy enough, he began to ask me a lot of personal questions, and he had a bizarre grin as he stared at me. He prattled on and on. I became more and more convinced that he was hitting on me, but I was afraid to be rude to him, because he was a big guy and I wasn't. When he stopped babbling to catch his breath, I told him as politely as I could that it was nice to meet him, but getting late, and I needed to sleep. And still, he kept jabbering away, so I kind of smiled and waved goodnight, then shut my door on him mid-sentence. I heard him pound on my door once more and say, "Arsehole." Then I heard him stomp back up the steps, which were right next to my door. I was about to find out that once he got angry, he stayed angry for a long time. By now, it was close to 11 p.m, but I was too nervous to sleep. All was quiet for about 5 minutes, when suddenly I heard a very loud bang on my front window. I pulled apart the vertical blinds, and he was standing out there pointing at me, with the scariest look of rage in his crazy eyes. He made a weird gesture that I couldn't interpret, and I immediately backed away from the window, letting the blinds fall back into place, half expecting him to break the glass. He shouted something in a drunken slur that I couldn't make out, but there was no other noise until I heard him run back up the stairs again. At this point, I thought it might be time to call the cops before he came back down. Now, The police dispatchers in this city had earned a bad reputation. They would keep asking questions about any situation until they found an excuse not to send anyone. That was my experience. A female answered my call and asked if my neighbor was specifically at the door or the window. Right at this very moment, I peeked out and saw that he wasn't, but I tried to explain the circumstances. She told me there was nothing she could do at this point, but that if I later have a life-threatening emergency, I should call 911. I thanked her for being so very, very helpful and ended the call. I didn't bother with police after that. A few moments later, I heard the first of many thuds outside. It sounded like someone had landed at the bottom part of my door, as if thrown from the stairway above. I couldn't see what it was through my peephole, and was now too terrified to even open the door and find out. I stood around my living room, wide awake into the night. Every once in a while, I heard some thuds, several splats, and then the shattering of what I correctly assumed was his now empty booze bottle, all just outside my door. After what seemed like forever, it finally stopped, and I got 2 or 3 hours of sleep until morning. When I got up, I opened my door to look around. Aside from all the broken glass from the large bottle, it looked like the weirdo had emptied out his entire refrigerator and garbage bin just to throw stuff at my apartment. I got a broom and cleaned up what I could, but there was a blob of goo made of some kind of flour and broken eggs that had landed on top of it. The stuff had hardened into a glue-like mass that I couldn't scrape up. Anyhow, I thought for now I would leave it there, just to show people what this nutjob had done. As soon as I could, I went to the property office to complain. The manager sympathized with me, because the weirdo had given her a bad time too. He'd been coming to the office yelling and cussing at her, refusing to pay rent, and even threatening her. She hated him and wanted him gone. She had me write up a testimony of what happened to help her in her case against him. I should mention that this happened in California, and there are laws that require a lot of legal red tape before anyone can get evicted. Even with the most unruly, deadbeat tenants, the process can take months. I spent the following night sleeping at my parents' place. A friend stayed with me in my own apartment the night after that, but we had no trouble from the lunatic upstairs. The next day, another neighbor asked me about the hideous lump of goo that was still in front of my door. I explained everything, and he told me to pour boiling water on it so that I could clean it up. I took his advice, and it worked. In the meantime, the crazy guy's roommate was back, and they frequently fought. One time, I heard the roommate say he was getting out of there, and the crazy one threw a potted plant at him as he went down the stairway. Another time, I saw them in the parking lot fighting over their pet chihuahua. The weirdo punches the other guy and storms upstairs with the dog under his arm. I found out later that the roommate was living in the US illegally and had nowhere else to live, so he kept coming back to stay with the maniac. After a week or two, I hadn't had any encounters with the creepy guy, but then one night, someone outside shouted fire. Looking out my window, I could see the dumpster engulfed in flames. Firefighters arrived, and I went out to join the small crowd watching them put it out. I noticed my very scary neighbor standing next to one of the fire crew, talking to him, but glancing in my direction. When the fire was extinguished, I turned to go inside. As I walked away, I overheard my neighbor tell the firefighter that I was a weirdo. I don't know who really set the dumpster on fire, but I have my suspicions. Next day, I checked back in with the apartment manager to see if we were any closer to seeing the last of that guy. She told me the wheels were in motion, but it would take more time. She also informed me that the weirdo was going around the complex slandering me, telling people that I was a peeping Tom. She scoffed. She knew he was full of shit. The last big incident happened like this. One afternoon, a woman who lived elsewhere in the complex found the roommate sitting on the sidewalk near our stairs. He was bruised and bloodied, and looked like he couldn't stand up. She asked him if he wanted her to call an ambulance, but he told her no. Just then, the weirdo came running down the stairs yelling at the woman. "What makes you think you can get involved? It's none of your business." Then he took a swing at her, and she ran off. A short time later, she came back with some police officers. The bloody man was no longer there, and neither was the other guy. The cops went up and knocked on the door, and got no answer. I never saw either of the two men again. Several days passed while I was worried the scary one would come back, but he didn't. One day, a few weeks ago, I was heading for the mailbox at the front of the complex. A man in a black shirt and pants came up to me holding a clipboard. He introduced himself as a detective and showed me a picture. It was the roommate. I first thought the guy in the black was from ICE or something, but apparently the pictured man's relatives had reported him missing. Unfortunately, I couldn't provide any information the officers didn't already have. I never had any trouble from the psycho's roommate, so I hoped he was okay. This story happened to my mother. She told it to me many a times when I was growing up. The story made her become very spiritually inclined. She has since passed on from cancer, and I'm hoping that by sharing her story, it'll do her justice. But anyway, to preface, my mother grew up in England in the 1950s. She was an orphan. She never knew who her parents were, and we never managed to trace them either. Not that she was super interested. This orphanage that she grew up in was notoriously haunted. All that I know is that it's somewhere in London, if it's even still about. There were 4 floors on the orphanage. The bottom floor is where there were several offices, as well as the food hall, with the upstairs being used as leisure and entertainment places, and bedrooms. My mother was one of a lot of girls who stayed there, and it was quite a gloomy and miserable place. One thing that she hated above all else was making friends, who would be adopted and she'd be left there on her own. For those of you wondering, my mother was sadly never adopted. When she was 18, she was told to pack her bags and find her own way in life, which she did. But anyway, as I was saying, this orphanage was a hub of paranormal activity. There were particular rooms which were always cold, and things would constantly go missing, day or night. Out of the many stories she told me, the one that stands out in particular is of her friend, Rebecca. My mum had been friends with Rebecca ever since they were about 7. She and her had got along great, and they were about 12 at this point, and they loved getting into mischief together, sneaking down to the kitchen in the dead of night and having a few midnight snacks, then coming back up and going to bed all quietly to make sure that they were undetected. It was on one of these occasions, where they thought that no one would notice them, where something did happen. It wasn't what you'd expect though. They'd gotten out of bed and had made their way down to the ground floor. It was there that they were rummaging through the fridge to be sneaky and get some leftovers of cake, as it was another girl's birthday earlier that week, and little bits of cake were still remaining in the fridge, probably for the staff. They just had a bit of a nibble. As my mother explains, food, especially tasty food, was quite scarce back then post-war, and they really needed to make the most of it. Once they'd had their fill of cake and silently washed their hands, did they know that they needed to make their way back up. It was a full moon and very bright outside. The kitchen also happened to border the garden. They were just staring out the window in the dead of night, listening to the sounds of the city and the silence of the house. They saw someone in the distance. A girl. Was someone outside? My mother began to worry. If there was another girl who was up, they'd ask why they were in the kitchen. Her and Rebecca started to panic. They weren't sure if it was one of the girls who lived here. They squinted, but they couldn't make out her face. The girl was seemingly walking in circles, illuminated by the pale moonlight, casting its light down below. She was just frolicking in the garden. Was she going mad? Surely not. It was their responsibility to notify an adult. Not only that, but it was quite cold, it being winter and all, and this girl was just wearing a summer dress, completely inappropriate clothing for the time. They knew that because they saw something, if something were to happen to that girl, it would be on their hands. It was a moral dilemma, and they were still not too sure what they had to do, or what their options were. Rebecca, thinking the right thing to do would be to wake up a member of the staff, told my mother that she was going to go up and wake someone. She knew that they'd get in trouble for this, but how much more trouble would they get in if that girl wasn't seen to? My mother said that she'd come with her up to the second floor and look out the window to make it look like they'd only been using the toilet. They made sure to check each other's faces really quick for any potential cake marks or crumbs, just so that they wouldn't be found out. And up they went. They tiptoed up the stairs as quietly as possible, and when they made it to the first floor landing, they looked out the window just to make sure that she was still there. And she was, just moving around, playing in the garden. So they crept around and up the next flight of stairs, and again looked to make sure she was still out there. She was. And when they made it to the final floor, they looked out the window one more time, but this time the girl was moving towards the house. They got closer to the window and looked down. The girl was now coming towards the stairs that led to the kitchen. But then she froze. In her stead, and her head slowly twisted up, and the girl from the garden was staring straight at Rebecca and my mother. The two girls just about wet themselves and screamed as loudly as they could. Of course, that woke up the responsible adult on that floor, and she came running out, demanding why the girls were screaming in the middle of the night. The girls pointed down to the garden, and of course, as they all looked down, tilting their heads to see if she'd made it to the kitchen, they saw nothing. All three of them ended up running down as quickly as they could to the bottom. They suspected that she could be a burglar, but they told her that she was a young girl of about their age. They looked around. The door was still locked. No windows were breached, and everything was in its place. They were very, very distraught. Neither Rebecca or my mother slept that night. The next morning, they had a conversation with the matron about what they saw. She asked some questions, and they explained that they were downstairs because they couldn't sleep and just wanted to look out the garden. She said that she wasn't sure if the matron bought their story or not, but that wasn't really the important thing. They explained that they saw this little girl in a summer dress playing in the garden, and when they went to get an adult, she stared up at them and disappeared. The matron asked them not to repeat this information, as it was very, very sensitive. She explained that this building had been destroyed during the London Blitz, in part, and that it was rebuilt a few years before. However, when a building like this gets hit, there are always casualties, and the only person who died was a young girl about that age. Since then, her spirit has been seen walking around the building or in the garden. It's mostly at night, but it's seen constantly. Other things that happened in the orphanage would be that things would constantly go missing. My mother would misplace many of her objects, only for them to reappear in the oddest of places. One thing she remembers above all other things is that she had a very, very ugly dolly. Her words, not mine. But she cherished it like nothing else. One morning when she awoke, it was gone. And 2 weeks later, when she'd finished doing her business in the loo, she was coming out, and it was just perched on top of the sink. It hadn't been there when she went in, and no one else had come in or out of that loo the whole time she'd been in the stool. She was completely and utterly taken aback when she saw it there. She's not sure how any of this happened, but they just seemed to accept the strange occurrences that happened because they lived there. When my mother moved out, she never experienced any paranormal activity again, but it did open her up to spirituality and played a big part in her life in later years. Wherever you are, Mum, I hope you're at peace. If memory serves me right, this happened in the summer of 06 or 07, so I must have been between 16 and 17. It takes place in a town in Bulgaria called Shumen. We were out at a bar with friends, and somewhere at about 12:30 a.m, we decided it was time to head back home. So when we separated, I was left with only one more friend, since he was heading my way. He's only a year older than me. We walked about 10 minutes until we decided to stop at a playground to sit on a bench, since my friend had a problem with his legs. During those years, he often felt pain from continuous walks, which might have been from the weightlifting he used to practice before then. We'd been sitting there for about 15 minutes, talking about this and that, when two guys that looked a bit younger than us, maybe a year younger, walked over. At that moment, I should probably mention that me and my friend are both male. I was about 170 centimeters tall and 62 kilos, whereas my friend was a bit heavier and about my height. These two guys were a bit taller than us, somewhere between 175 and 180 centimeters, and they looked quite fit. At first, the conversation was rather ordinary. They asked us what we were doing there, what our names were, and where we lived. As stupid as I am, I answered them honestly. The only direct answer that I didn't give was where I lived, since I only mentioned a pub that was near my home. But my friend, let's call him Enzo, thoughtfully gave them lies to each question. They noticed that we were playing with something, which was my MP4 player, and little by little, this is where things started going wrong. Hey, what's that? It's my MP4 player. Oh, cool. How much is it? I don't know. It was a present for my birthday last year, and it's not really polite to ask how much a gift costs. Can I see it for a bit? Sure. When a stranger asks you something like that, it would be the smartest thing to say no. Judging by Enzo's look, that's what he wanted me to say. But with my polite nature, I stupidly gave it to them. They started looking at it from the side and muttering something to each other. They'd been looking at it for about 2 minutes, not saying a word, and I was thinking during that time that Enzo was slightly starting to get a little further from the three of us. I was starting to worry a bit that they were taking their time looking at it, so I asked for them to return it since we really had to go. One of the guys looked at me for a second and walked behind the other guy. The other guy started talking some random stuff. I can't remember what exactly, but it was obvious he was trying to divert my attention from the other guy. I say to them, "Come on guys, it's really late. Where's the rush? Let's talk a little longer." I was starting to shake, since I didn't like where things were going. And honestly, I've never felt like picking fights or even arguing, and these guys were clearly trying my patience. "I think we've talked enough. Please return the MP4 player." Then the other guy turned back to me and mockingly said, "I don't know what you're talking about." At the same time, I could clearly hear the music escaping the MP4 player. He had put it in his shoe between it and his foot. "Come on, it's not funny." They started laughing like a bunch of idiots, and it was clear that I wasn't getting that MP4 player back easily. One of the guys noticed Enzo had turned his back and had walked a little far from us. "Hey dude, what are you doing over there? The fun's over here." Enzo was trying to call one of our bigger friends at the time, but when he noticed that guy was walking over to him, he quickly put his phone back into his pocket. "Come on, come over here." Both of us were on edge, unsure of what we were going to do now, and they kept mocking and teasing. I tried asking a few more times, hoping they would quit, but they kept enjoying themselves. So I got pissed, and tried the same thing Enzo was doing, but I wasn't trying to hide it. I turned my back and started walking a little faster to the side, scrolling my call list, searching for the same friend Enzo was trying to dial. Then I heard that irritating voice behind me. "Come on, don't do that. Give me that phone." I ignored the guy, but while I was still scrolling, I saw with my peripheral how close he was, and for a part of a second, kicked my hand when my phone went flying. Enzo tried to run and grab it, but the other guy got to it first. Now they looked more serious. Now, since you have an MP4 player, you must have earphones, right?" I shook and didn't say a thing. I think the earphones were swinging from my shirt then. I just grabbed them and took a few steps back. Even though we were older than these two, they were much faster, and I was starting to wonder what the hell we were going to do. I hadn't been in a fight since 5th grade, and even then I wasn't very good at it. I was sure if it went down to it, that we might get hurt, or at least me, and the guy was still walking over to me. "Come on, hand them over. You must have some hidden coke in them." When I heard that, I didn't know if this guy was serious or just plain stupid. First of all, I'd never heard of anyone in town talk about drugs, and second, these were small earphones. You clearly couldn't hide anything in them. He mumbled something about the rubber over the earphones could hide a little bit, and still just thought the guy was an idiot. But I was more worried about what we were going to do. Just as though we didn't have a choice, I heard Enzo yelling, "Hey, "Hey!" When I turned around, a patrol police car was driving by the street next to the playground, and fortunately it stopped. At that moment, the two threw my MP4 player and my phone, which ended up with a cracked screen after the second it had fallen to the ground, and started running to the lower opposite side of the playground. The car sped off after them, and Enzo quickly helped me get my stuff off the ground. "What do we do now?" "Let's just go back home. I don't want to keep up with this crazy night." He might have been hoping that I was suggesting to go to the police and explain to them what had happened, but I was shaken and tired from the whole ordeal. We reached my street several minutes later, and I talked for a little more and tried to relax, before he left off for his home, which was much further from mine. On the next morning he called me and told me when he was walking by the police, he noticed that one of the guys was just walking out. He was at a safe distance, so the guy didn't notice him. They probably couldn't hold him there since there was no evidence of anything happening, besides a bunch of kids falling around. I told my parents a little later, and they knew how frightened I felt. Since they know me to be very peaceful, and as I mentioned before, I hate getting into fights. I know I have to be able to defend myself, but that's how I am. We never did go to the police to inform them of what happened, and we moved on. We still remember that night, even though I've mostly forgotten what they looked like. Enzo says he still remembers both of their faces. I remember only one, since he pretty much reminded me of the wrestler Jack Swagger. Anyway, stupid future drug addicts, let's not meet again. Let me tell you of the grocery store man. Having left the office late, my friend and I commuted back to the town in which we lived. We were each in our own vehicles, which comes in later. We had decided beforehand to stop off at the local supermarket for our tradition of checking out steaks and seeing if we could pick up anything decent at a good price. As usual, all the good ones had been taken, so my friend grabbed a couple of ingredients for spaghetti, and we checked out and left. Outside, we came to where our cars were parked. The parking lot was fairly deserted, and our cars were in a pretty open spot. A few spaces away, a running car was parked, and a middle-aged man was loudly speaking to a dog inside, commanding it to sit and stay. I didn't catch the dog's name. It didn't seem important. My friend and I talk. We were talking about the possibility of an office reunion, and we stood outside for a few moments, talking about the recent SNL opening hosted by Steve Carell. Finally, we parted ways and each got into our cars. My friend pulled away, and that's when the man talking to his dog made eye contact with me. "He's a good dog, military trained," the man shouted at me with a grin. Being of a small town custom, I returned the smile and shouted back, "Right on." Evidently, the man took this as an invitation to approach me. I'm not exactly the most welcome or social person, so this wasn't very pleasant for me. Wanting to be polite, I listened to him explain that he was ex-military and had gotten the dog from the military. I kept the door of the car between him and I, and kept one foot in the car, which I hoped he would understand from my body language as me wanting to leave. I thought it was a bit odd that a middle-aged man would just randomly approach a bigger guy in the parking lot of a grocery store. Instead, he explained to me that he was picking up a few things for a party he was having. He held his hand really close to my face and flashed a mini bottle of whiskey. "I've got a little bit of weed in the car," he explained with a grin, "and a bit of liquor for a good time." I nodded and said something along the lines of, "Sounds like a good time. He pointed to his car and explained that he had taken it from his ex. That bitch never paid for it. I've taken it to the sheriff and everything. They said it was a civil matter, so I'm in the clear. They're good guys. I know them all. I nodded along. I took a long look at his pupils to check for severe constrictions or dilations, but they didn't seem abnormal. The man still seemed high, or maniac or something. At this point, he thought it acceptable to show me that he was carrying a firearm. He lifted his coat up and said, "Got a .38 here. It's got real power." I'm not really a stranger to guns, so this wasn't the kind of thing to freak me out. Overall, though, I was starting to get a strange feeling from the guy. He was clearly either under the influence or something else. I didn't want to stay any longer, so I explained that I had to get going. He nodded and said, "Well, here's my number, man. Give me a call. We should party or something." He held up his hand for a fist bump, which I accepted. He then listed off his cell phone number and told me to call. I told him his number back, so I wouldn't have to grab my phone or look for a pen or anything. "I'll add you to my friends list, man," he said. "I got this great place with a pool and sweet wood stove. You can come out and we can party. We'll make it all topless too, 18 plus only." He gave me a weird look. "How old are you, by the way?" "I'm 24. "That sounds like fun, dude," I replied. "I'm a Christian though, so I'm not too interested in that kind of stuff." Suddenly his demeanor changed. "Oh, me too, friend. God saved me, and I got the spirit in me." He then proceeded to roll the sleeves of his left arm up and pointed to his arm. "My arm hair moves when the spirit is moving in me." He then pointed to a street lamp that had turned on. "I saw God once. It was like that strange orange glow everywhere, man." I nodded along and said my traditional, "Right on, man." This is my usual go-to for all conversations. He then asked my name. "Jerry," I told him. "That's my son's name," he shouted. He then told me to call him, and I listed off his number again, assuring him that I would give him a call when I leave. Stuffing the mini bottle of whiskey into his pocket, he explained, "All that stuff about partying, I don't really do it. I smoke a little weed here and there and drink sometimes, you know." I gave my usual, "Right on, man." This man was distracted by a woman in a blue Jeep pulling up next to his car. "Good doggy," he shouted out as the woman got out of her car. "Good doggy. She's gonna get a treat." I thought the man was talking about the woman. She also appeared rather uncomfortable, a feeling that I shared. "I love your car, ma'am," he then shouted. "Go Michigan." A Michigan football team that has blue as their primary color. I started to slide into my car when he grabs the sleeve of my sweatshirt. "Hey man, forgot to tell you, I was in the music video for Millionaire's Son. You know, that Creedence song?" Of course, the song is actually named Fortunate Son, but I slide into my car as he explains how he was in the army during the Iran hostage crisis. I mentioned my grandfather was a Marine, which he then takes as an invitation to grab my shoulder and tell me about his personal rivalry with the Marine Corps. He then mentions he was a military driver and a trick to driving intoxicated. Finally, I get into my car and back out, eager to leave. I pull out of the store and out onto the street, only to see that he's following me. Great. I had already dialed up my friend to explain this strangest conversation. When I see this guy's car following me, I get into the other lane and pull into the lot of our local sheriff's station. He leaves me after pulling up alongside, honking several times. I didn't see him after that. My friend told me I should call the cops. Thinking back on the guy telling me about carrying a gun with a ton of alcohol and weed and driving a potentially stolen car, I think my friend was right. I'm a little bit socially unaware, so I didn't think back on it. Either way, grocery guy, let's not meet again. I work at Pizza Hut. We obviously have a walk-in fridge. It has 2 entrances, one by the make table and one in the hall leading to the back. I was walking to the sink to wash my hands after making a pizza. About a foot from the sink, the door to the walk-in slowly opened. It didn't open very far, about 9 inches. The head manager has told me that she often hears stuff when she's doing prep work alone in the morning. I still get weird feelings in the walk-in fridge. Also, I thought I've heard people say my name. I live in a fairly rural area. In my opinion, it's extremely haunted. I live near several sets of what I suspect to be artificial woods. One time I was walking across a little bridge over a creek leading to a pool house, and I swear on my life I saw a medium-tall red-haired girl, a little younger than me. She was pale as death, and her eyes looked black. I walked straight through, then looped around back to my house. This was the first spooky thing I've seen by that pool house. I've also seen various sets of occult graffiti, such as pentagrams and the like around the buildings. I also saw a man in a tweed business suit and one of the barbershop quartet hats, standing about 3 to 5 meters into the woods across from the pool house. I should note that my town is the country seat, so it may have been the spectre of an old lawyer or businessman. 2 of my friends and I, Alfred and Damon, were out walking in a different set of woods near a park. It has several public trails in it, but we got a little off the beaten path to one of our usual hangout spots. Just some rocks on the edge of the creek. It was early March, so there was still some snow and ice. We heard a weird gurgling/moaning sound. It sounded like a big frog, but twisted. We hightailed it out of there. We seldom go back to those woods anymore, and it still gives us the heebie-jeebies. Speaking of my friend Damon, he was walking in the woods across from that pool house. Apparently, he and Alfred had found pentagrams in the dirt, as well as candles. But anyway, Damon was walking in the woods, and he saw me in the woods. At that time and that day I was in town. I was wearing a new shirt, a shirt that Damon had never seen me wear before. It was a mastodon shirt. He said the apparition was of me wearing the shirt, and was very desperate to A, get away, B, hide its face, and Damon is of Hindu Indian descent, and his parents are from Trinidad and Tobago. He said that his father has routinely experienced incidents like this back home in Trinidad and Tobago. Damon has also seen apparitions of Alfred, and Alfred has also seen apparitions of Damon, and I am the only one who, thankfully, hasn't experienced this. We used to live at our grandparents' house. I was only around 2 when we left, but my siblings and mother have a multitude of stories. Once, when I was around 1, my mother was having trouble getting my crib open. She was very frustrated, sat down to regather her strength, and after a little less than a minute, the door to the crib just slowly slid down, as if someone was gently opening it. My brother and sister would routinely hear footsteps and voices and the like all around my grandparents' house. As I aged and visited their home, I would also experience the voices and footsteps. When I was around 2, my mum and dad were talking, and my dad said something apparently not good. I had been staring into a corner in the ceiling. I had turned to my dad and said, "Ghosty, hear you, Daddy." When I was 4, we moved to a townhouse in Aberdeen, Maryland. If you know anything about Aberdeen, you know it's not a very good town. I was about 5 or 6 when I was sitting in our kitchen. Then all of a sudden, an old man dressed in very old-fashioned farmer clothes and carrying a lantern walked out of the laundry room, then just vanished into thin air. Apparently, a man's son was kidnapped by Native Americans in the mid-1800s, and he searched for him for years. I don't know what became of him. Around that time, my older brother Boris moved to Havre de Grace, Maryland. He lived in a very nice house with our father. He would routinely experience paranormal activity, such as footsteps, banging, and whispering. But one day, he was microwaving a Hot Pocket. There was a bathroom across from the kitchen. He turned and looked. The door was ajar, and there was a man made of static, just staring out at him. He then said the static man just slowly stepped back into the darkness of the bathroom. On one occasion, my brother heard a very loud banging from the basement. He grabbed a baseball bat and headed downstairs. Nothing. They searched the house. Nothing. He lived in a very good neighborhood, so he thinks a burglary attempt was unlikely. This was also a common occurrence. My sister Anne has a collection of porcelain dolls, most of which belonged to my deceased grandmother. I think they're haunted. When I'm home alone, I will occasionally hear talking and footsteps around my house. I hate dolls. Most of the noise seems to originate from my sister's room. My family and I have all seen stuff in Gettysburg. It's mostly just been the usual stuff. Apparitions, cannon fire outside the reenactment sessions, and other such paranormal occurrences. I'm sure there are more stories I'm forgetting about. I know all this testimony sounds very untrustworthy and made up. I just really wanted to share these experiences, as it seems that the paranormal follows me. This happened about 12 years ago. I was 16 to 18 during the duration and was female identified at the time. I'm still not sure what to make of this situation, but I've started to realize it may have been more sinister than I thought. This story needs some caveat. First, I'm incredibly naive when it comes to someone flirting with me or hitting on me. I never think people are serious when they hit on me, and this has gotten me into some tight spots in the past. Some of those, like this one, I got out of. Others, I wasn't so fortunate. This also meant that until very recently, I didn't realize the danger I've been in. Second, I grew up in a very small and very evangelical Republican town. My small Methodist church wasn't too crazy on Sunday mornings, but the youth group was much more radical. Speaking in tongues, being slain in the spirit. And when I say my town was small, I mean that my graduating class was 149 students, and we were the biggest graduating class in years. My school was so small that my father was teaching for 3 years. Everyone knew my dad and my family. Third, I believed for the most of my youth that the most important objective in the world was saving souls for Jesus Christ. This conviction trumped everything else, especially feelings of discomfort. In high school, I joined Young Life and became a junior leader quickly after. Young Life, for those of you who don't know, is like a cooler version of youth group, although they would reject this. College kids would meet with high schoolers. They were cool and loved Jesus and would preach at you without you knowing it. We would meet with any high schoolers who wanted to come at someone's house on a Wednesday. It was usually at my parents' place. So I was in high school trying to get people to come to my house to hear about Jesus. Anyone and everyone was welcome, including Ted. Ted was 2 to 3 years older than me, and he was just a weird guy. I don't mean that as judgmental. I'm a weirdo. It's more that something was off about him. At the time, I didn't want to listen to my gut, telling me to stay the hell away from him. Ted was very poor, as was the case for most of my school, so he usually was wearing tattered and smelly clothes. He also couldn't afford a car, so he would walk everywhere, which was a feat in a rural town. Before we started having meetings at my house, I would give him rides to ones at other places. I would see him walking there on the side of the road, and I would feel bad. The first meeting at my house, he showed up 3 hours early. I was a little put off, but I figured he didn't have a great home life, and thought he just wanted to be out of his home. I gave him some food, and let him have free reign of our computer while I did homework. The meeting happened, and he went home. I told myself that my ill feelings about him were just as sinful as my judgmental nature. After that, I started to see him around school more often, and it weirded me out a bit, but I chalked it up to paranoia. Women often feel like they're overreacting when they feel threatened by men, mostly because society and literally everyone else tells us we are. Don't ignore your gut. The next time I had a Young Life at my house, he literally showed up right from school, about an hour's walk from my house, so 4 hours early. I was not expecting him at all, and my parents weren't home from work yet. I had been in the shower when he showed up. I came down in my bath towel and a towel wrapped on my head. When I heard knocking, I assumed it was my cousin, my best friend and closest neighbor, so I didn't bother to get dressed. There he was, and I'm in my goddamn towel. I told him that he could help himself to whatever was in the fridge, and that he could use the computer while I finished getting ready. I ran upstairs, locked the bathroom door, and texted my parents and cousin, asking when they'd be home, but no one responded. I finished my shower and got dressed. When I came out of my room, he was standing at the foot of the stairs just staring. I was completely unnerved and asked him if he was having any problems with the computer. He didn't say anything, just stared at me, and eventually went back downstairs to the basement where the computer was. I ran to my room, locked the door, and waited for one of my parents to arrive home. Finally, the meeting took place, and he went home. Then he started showing up at random places I was at. I still can't figure out how he knew I would be in the mall, or at the soccer field, or at home, and he would just be there. He started showing up at my parents' house on days there weren't meetings. Luckily, around this time I got a license, and I kept offering rides to anyone. I would caravan people home, and by the time I got back, Ted would be there, but so would my parents. Thankfully, my dad started to catch on, even though I never said a word to anyone. My dad was a woodshop teacher, and he and my mum built their house, and he built himself an epic woodshop detached from it. When Ted would come over, my dad would direct him to his woodshop and make him help him with a project while telling him I wasn't around until he left. This happened until I graduated, where Ted would just be there. After I went to college at a different state, Ted kept showing up at my parents' house until my dad told him I wouldn't be around anymore. So anyway, is this guy a stalker? Lonely? Socially inept? It just creeps me out. I'm back in my hometown to take care of my parents. Ted, don't come round. Let's not meet again. This happened to me a while ago, but I remembered it when I was talking to some friends recently and thought that you guys may appreciate it. I attended a small liberal arts university between a desert and some mountains in the southwestern United States. After a couple of years, I opted to move off campus with my boyfriend, and we found the cheapest housing imaginable in a tiny town across the wash and up against the mountains. Very few people lived there, and except for us, all of them belonged to two minority groups that hated each other, some of which were involved in active gang warfare that I suspected was related to the drug trade in a nearby city, a very large and depressed one for that area. We lived in a small gated complex with a sad pool and 6 studio apartments, and things in the area were just kind of strewn about. There was no landscaping on any of the properties, just desert sand everywhere. Chickens and dogs roamed free, and you could hear gunshots nearby sometimes. We lived there because the rent was $120 a month, compared to the $1,200 a month apartments in any of the nearby towns. I made friends with neighbors on both sides of the violence and was treated well by everyone. We just tried to be helpful, but otherwise kept to ourselves, and living there really wasn't bad. The police would, however, take forever to appear if ever you did have a problem. The morning was on a weekend, but I was helping some professors with field work in the high desert, so I had to head out unusually early. I dragged myself into some clothes at 5 a.m, grabbed the equipment I needed, and loaded up my car, chiding myself for not picking anything up for food, as I was probably going to be in the rural desert areas well into the afternoon. As I was getting into my car, I saw a huge, angry-looking man heading my way from across the street. He was athletic-looking, like a bouncer, was at least 6'4", wearing what the locals refer to as a wife-beater and jeans, and in his early 40s. I only barely had enough time to discreetly hit the lock button before he was right beside the driver's side window. It was a good thing I did, because he immediately tried the handle. "What do you think you're doing?" he said in a very pissed off tone. I looked around the empty streets, as if some other person would materialize and make sense of this for me. I had never seen this guy before. I wondered if anyone knew I was there. "Well?" He really did look mad, and he was staring down at me through the window, inches away. "What?" I said, placing the key in the ignition to start my tiny Aveo. But he put himself so close that I couldn't move without the risk of hitting him. "You heard me. What are you doing?" "Driving?" I said, trying to read his expression. "The hell you are. Get out the car now." I looked around more frantically, but everyone was asleep behind multiple barriers. I began to imagine him dragging me into the dark housing project across the way. Being pulled into a van might be even worse. I wasn't sure what to say, so I just stared at him, hoping he didn't notice my right hand behind me, fumbling for my phone. I said, "Get your ass out the car. Get out the car." At this point, he starts pounding his fist on the glass of my window. Not hard enough to break it, but threateningly. I honk the horn once, but it's puny and quiet, and no one appears. Thanks, Chevrolet. I finally muster enough confidence to say, "What's the problem here?" and sound reasonably incredulous. My thoughts are racing. No one would think twice about a broken window. It would take hours for my boyfriend to notice my car is still here. I left my knife inside, and I gave my pepper spray to a friend. I don't have anything to really defend myself with. "If you don't get out this car this instant, I'm gonna drag your ass out of it." He's still yelling. I feel trapped and frantic for a moment before he continued. "And get your parents out here, and they'll give you a whooping you ain't ever seen." A wave of hope crashed over me, and I was momentarily suspended between fear and relief. "What? How old are you anyway?" Carefully, in full view of him, I pulled out my wallet and withdrew my license, placing it against the glass so that he could read it, and leaning around it so that I could see him, and so that he could see that it was my face on it. He stared at it for a moment, and then broke into a wide, sheepish smile, and began to back away. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry, miss. I'm sorry. I thought you were like 14. I thought you were taking your parents' car for a drive." And I was like, "That kid can't drive. No way that kid can drive. You look very young. I'm sorry." He headed back across the street, then, as an afterthought, said, "That hat makes you look very young. Have a nice day." I tried to smile and wave good-naturedly. I realized the guy felt bad, and instead of a violent, rapey gangster, was most likely a thoughtful, concerned citizen. He actually looked a lot nicer now, as he continued to wave awkwardly. I caught my breath, put my Aveo in gear, and got out of there. I decided I would stop somewhere to pick up breakfast, after all. We moved a lot when I was a kid, but throughout high school, I always used the same bus stop. It was about a half block away, where our quiet suburban street intersected with a slightly busier one. I was often there alone early in the morning. For the longest time, the most interesting thing that might happen was a raven scolding me from a tree, or that a family of deer would follow me from the park across the street from my house to the bus stop through the fog, and past me to walk into the forest preserve beyond the intersection. It was a quiet neighborhood, and only a handful of cars might pass by while I waited for the bus. The deer stopped following me after the harassment began. That morning, a Jeep suddenly hits the brakes and slowed to a stop in front of me. The driver had all the windows rolled down, even though it was a chilly, wet autumn morning, one of those days where the mist just clings to and saturates everything, and the clouds are so low in the sky that you feel like the world is just a big room that you're in. Because of the fog, they hadn't seen me until they were a few meters away, and their braking made a screeching sound. They stopped their car, and the driver just sat there staring straight at me. I couldn't make them out. They were wearing a light grey hooded sweatshirt and sunglasses. I didn't see anyone else in the car. After about 30 tense seconds, during which my bemusement gave way to concern that someone was going to hit this guy stopped in the road, he finally turned to me, yelled a racial slur, smiled, and took off. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was newish to the area. I'm not great with faces, and I figured it was one of the kids at the high school trying to be edgy, or maybe just a local asshole who had mistaken my ethnic background. Either way, I didn't think about it at all until next week, when it happened again. This time the guy had friends with him. The windows were tinted, and they only cracked them down so that I couldn't see them. He yelled a different slur at me, and I could hear their laughs as they drove away. This continued to happen, sometimes twice a week, sometimes going months in between. They sounded young, so I continued to write it off as another local weirdo hazing ritual. But gradually, it began to get under my skin. There were two things that bothered me about it. First, the slurs. They were ugly and hateful, and they sounded promisingly violent to me, even though I felt like they could tell that I wasn't a Mexican or an Asian person or any of the other groups they use slurs for. Second, their license plate was obscured every time. This is a very wealthy area, and the local law enforcement wouldn't call anyone out who lived there on a violation, so I wasn't surprised that they got away with it. But it did give me a pause. One morning, I was ready to yell back at them, but instead of yelling anything, they just swerved at my location on the sidewalk. I jumped out of the way and ran behind a fence, but the Jeep ended up whipping through where I had been standing before speeding off. I figured the kid had overshot it and hadn't actually meant to hurt me, but some of the things that followed have since made me wonder. One morning, I came up to the bus stop, and there was just blood all over the area where I usually stood. It was wet for the rain, but otherwise congealing, turning dark in places. But I knew what it was. It wasn't a huge amount, but it was off-putting. A few days later, there was a dead animal there, mangled and brutalized. It wasn't roadkill. I couldn't take my eyes off it. Even after getting on the bus, it wasn't there when I returned in the afternoon. It wasn't an accident. I felt certain of it. It looked to me as though it had been stabbed repeatedly. Extreme overkill. I started to see the Jeep outside the morning bus stop, but the windows were never down, and it always sped off when I looked at it, or I otherwise couldn't get to it before it left. This carried on for years. One day in the summer, I was walking through my neighborhood with a friend, and the Jeep came by at a very high speed, and an egg hit me in the chest. It flowed down my shirt and onto my pants, and all I could think to do was turn to my friend James and say, "You saw that, right?" Because until then, no one else had ever witnessed the events, and my family members seemed skeptical when I mentioned it. I had to go home and change my clothes and take a shower, since the egg hit me at such high speed that it went into my hair and everywhere. It was then that I started to take this situation more seriously, and I had a bruise for weeks. I started to catch a ride with my brother in the mornings, or wait behind the local NFL player's fence until I heard the bus coming down the street. I didn't ever go outside until I had text confirmation that my ride was there. If I heard a car coming on a walk, I would run off into the bushes. They swerved at me a few more times, and then I never saw them again. Some other strange things happened, and I've had stalkers since. but I've never been able to connect them to the events, nor figure out who the people in the Jeep were or where they lived. My parents have moved to a different part of the community now, but I'm still jumpy when I walk around in that area. Creepy Jeep psycho neighbor, whoever you are, let's never meet again. I am a 27-year-old girl, and even though this story happened almost 20 years ago, I still think back to it every year around this time. I was a 9-year-old girl in 4th grade, and it was Valentine's Day. We had spent the week decorating our class door for the yearly competition and making a big card for our principal/vice principal and other office staff signed by all of our class, and our entry and invitation to come see our theme decorated door. I don't remember how this part came about, but I was the one to walk downstairs to the office and to turn in our card. It was simple enough, and I always looked forward to getting out of the classroom, even for a little while. So I started to the office. Nothing spectacular happened on the way down or in the office. It was just a normal walk through the halls and down the stairs, and then cheerfully turning in our class Valentine's Day card. I started down the same direction I came from, but had chosen to go up a different set of stairs than the ones I had gone down. Now, just some small layout for you. The school is a big rectangle, with a large auditorium with granite floors, and the second floor was a couple of stories up, and had an open balcony with a short railing overlooking this space. The classrooms bordered the hallway, and all had windows facing outwards. It was also a World War I historical building, and cannot be changed significantly or knocked down. Back to the story. I was coming up and out of the stairwell, and had started to walk towards my classroom, but I heard a whistle, one that sounded like a bird, and instinctively I turned around to see what it was. There was a boy sitting on the floor outside of one of the 6th grade classes. Kids were typically sent to sit outside the classroom as a mild punishment or to calm down. When I turned around to look, I met eyes with the boy, and he had some kind of smirk on his face. Before I could turn back around to start walking, this kid says, "Ooga booga." Seriously, what? I giggled and then just turned around to get back to class. A few seconds later, I was being pushed up against a short railing, looking over the auditorium far below. He pushed and pushed, and it was quite a struggle. I will not pretend like it was easy for me as a little girl, but I somehow managed to kick him right where it mattered, if you know what I mean. The boy dropped down, and I ran crying back to the classroom. I don't remember much of these events that followed immediately after. I really think I was in shock. However, I know exactly how it all turned out. My mum was pissed beyond words. I am her only child, and it took her over 5 years to have me. So needless to say, she was livid at the idea of losing me to a violent child. My mum threatened lawsuits and going to the local news and newspapers. It turns out, this kid had many behavioural, mental and learning disabilities, and his parents had not been giving him the correct medication or attention that he required. It was a long argument that went on for weeks, but in the end, my mum did have sympathy for the boy who was clearly not being given the care he needed. She did not, however, have sympathy for his parents, who she saw as responsible. My mum settled for having the boy removed from the school district and having the school put in taller railings so this might not happen again to someone else. But the story doesn't end there. After this event, my mum was ultra paranoid and signed her little ballerina up for karate. I was not thrilled about this, and my thought was, I defended myself just fine, so why do I need karate? Anyway, when I showed up for the first class, you want to know who I saw in the room? Yup, it was the boy who had tried to push me over the railings. I pointed him out to my mum, and she was in 100 miles per hour crazy mummy mode all over again. After my mum explaining what the boy had done to the owner/instructor, the boy's mum were told she could no longer bring him to class there, and they were asked to leave immediately. His mum got mad at me. Why she misdirected her anger, I will never know. Her child could have killed me, or left me seriously injured at the very least. It was due to her negligence and her son's behavior. As much as I know it was due to his very unfortunate circumstances, that doesn't make it okay. That doesn't make me feel safe to be in the same room as him. And I also don't know why she thought it would be appropriate for a proven violent child to be taking martial arts. Therapy would have been more a logical route. After that, I didn't stay in karate long, as I always was more of a girly girl, interested in dance and Barbie dolls. All the years later, I still think back to it to this day. I wonder what became of that boy. I wonder if he got the help he needed. I wonder if he remembers, and sometimes I even ask myself if it was all a dream. But it was not a dream. It is always something I will remember, and I've learnt many lessons that day. The biggest being always be aware of your surroundings. These events happened within the last months of 2018, over a 4-month period to be exact. The Tales of the North, as I can colourfully dub them, started when I decided to attend a college in the north of New Jersey to renew my certification in interpreting. The neighbourhood in which the school is located in is, to say the least, a bit shady, and not all desirable to navigate to at night. Points of general interest are easy enough to get to, and for what it's worth, I'd move back to that neighbourhood. But when you're surrounded by druggies hidden in corners, you never know what can happen. Outside my very own apartment, I heard tell of a dude being chucked from a moving car, all battered and beaten, as the people he was with just dipped. So yeah, the things you do for betterment, right? The first story occurs either in late October or mid-November, certainly after my girlfriend, who I'll call Richie, and I got together. It was one of those days where an escape is much, much needed and deserved. She and I had been planning to step out and live a bit, rather than sitting around Netflix and chilling, or other typical lazy person stuff. An iced coffee and donut run seemed the ideal thing to interrupt our monotonous evening. We've all been there. Our original plan was simply to Uber there, like regular people, in Rochelle's words. Yet, due to some 33-year-old woman-child overhearing us, or being invited by Richie herself, we were forced to walk, due to this infant having wormed herself into our date, wanting to exercise, and Richie's overly nice and accommodating personality. So it's me, my girl who has anxiety, and this chick that we're basically babysitting, all out on a glorious adventure where anything could happen. Indeed, Richie and I were muttering how bullshit this turned out to be, and how she was so sorry she didn't just say screw it and get an Uber. Now, perhaps I should mention that we're all visually impaired, Richie and I are totally blind, and the girl with us is partially. So, of all of us, I am still the most at ease and calm, being used to travelling alone. Typical introvert loner dude. Don't judge. So we've been on the road for at least 10 minutes, and after some minor detouring in the usual, Dunkin' Donuts is here. Right? Yeah, it is. We somehow got derailed and decided on going to a Starbucks. Coffee is coffee in the end, I guess. During this time, I'm thinking, these two can stay. I'm getting a cab back home. Yeah, nobody was in the mood anymore. To you walkers out there, I'm sorry for dissing your style. Of course, it's when we head back to the apartment that things happened. We start walking back home. The woman child in front of us is whining on about something, while Richie and I are giving the Uber everywhere vow. We're on the same road between the cafe and the apartment complex, when some woman appears from probably some back alley and intercepts us. You guys need help? Come on, I got ya. I am on my guard at once. She positively reeks of liquor, and is possibly tweaked out on some crap. I'm a school teacher, you know, she incoherently slurs, as I slowly move in front of Richie. Our companion becomes far more reserved as this crazy tweaker tries to lead us through the alleyways. I'm just thinking, how the hell to lose this lady? Richie was just hoping not to die. At long last, we come to the street where the complex is located, and I try to subtly drop the hint to the teacher that she can leave now, and that we have it from here. A convenient commotion from some rabble-rousers must have distracted the tweaker for long enough for me to push the girls into the path of the apartment. The tweaker yelling after us, all the while as we vanished into our lobby, never again seeing her. Richie and I can laugh about it now. Indeed, we often use the school teacher as an inside joke, but still, who can say what might have come to pass? Segueing into the next story, which happened only to me. I was heading to a 7-Eleven or something, walking, ironically. Nearing my destination, another tweaker in all his tweaking glory popped up and pursued me, trying to talk to me as if I were his bro. Bro, piss off, you're not welcomed. I say that, escaping into the store. Even within the store I could hear the guy yelling. He doesn't want to be my friend. He doesn't like me. I don't have a friend. Now, we backtrack to what I believe was September, when I first met Richie, and my face lights up even as I think about it. This event was hers. She was with some residents of the complex outside at about 7 or 8, and we hadn't even been hanging out, sadly. As I recall it, she was standing apart from the others who were vaping or something, and some blokes started literally circling her while sniffing. Yeah, she said that they were sniffing her. I am a female living in New England. To add another detail, this took place in a decent neighborhood. We weren't white trash or anything. Anyway, here it goes. Several years ago, the day before my 10th birthday, I was arriving home with my mother and little brother from a soccer game that my brother had. We were arriving at our own house when my brother noticed a yard sale next door. This house was run down. Apparently, some police activity went on before I was born, but that was over now, right? So a man walks up to us, and he introduces himself. We'll call him Ray. Ray was renting from the woman next door. Basically, this woman had a house with 4 rooms. One for her, one for her disabled son, and 2 for whoever paid money to live there for any amount of months. Ray seemed nice. He played a bit of soccer on the sidewalk with my brother and spoke nicely to my mother. He looked a bit trashy, but I didn't care. I just wanted to go inside my house and play Minecraft. So I left, not thinking much about the ordeal. This was in October. In late January, a few months later, I was barely awake when my dad picked me up out of my bed and carried me into the master bedroom, where my mum and brother were. The master bedroom is the furthest room away from the place where Ray was. I didn't like being disturbed, so I ran back to my own bedroom. My dad yelled, saying that there were police next door and I should go back into the other room. I did as I was told. I was so scared. Apparently, Ray's ex had gone over to the house to pick up some of her things. She brought her new boyfriend along, and Ray started stabbing the boyfriend, and police were called. Guns and all. I thought it was a one-time occurrence. I thought I'd be safe after that. It was March now. My mum picked me up from school as usual. My brother was staying after school for guitar lessons. She'd get him later. I threw my backpack in the trunk and asked why there were so many suitcases in the back. She cheerfully explained that we were staying at a hotel. We drove around town, and she finally said my dad would take me back home, that we wouldn't be staying at a hotel. I came home with Dad. I noticed there was police tape on our lawn. My dad said they'd found drugs in Ray's house. That comment really didn't settle in until later. The full story was, Ray was doing PCP on his own front steps. Someone noticed and called the police. Police came, half chased Ray into the next town over, and half investigated the house. An officer picked up the package with drugs and immediately begins to have a bad reaction. Hazmat was called, and they find a drug lab. Thinking it's a meth lab, the police advise my mother to evacuate, which she does. Turns out it wasn't meth, so we could come back. But he was manufacturing this other stuff. My mum arrives home with my brother a few hours after I did, and that's when reality sets in. I had an anxiety attack. I couldn't eat, and sat behind our couch, using it as a makeshift bunker. I didn't sleep that night. A bit later, Ray, newly released from jail, does more illegal things. But the evidence room was tampered with, so he couldn't be convicted. Meanwhile, my family has brought a new house, a large dog, security cameras, and plenty of weapons. My brother and I already attended therapy, but now our sessions happened more frequently. We were moving in 2 months. Meanwhile, Ray would watch us from his back porch, just sitting there. My dad confronted him once, and Ray started shouting death threats. The day we moved, Ray let his pit bull loose. It was in the evening, and he didn't know we had already left. He just knew it'll be around the time we were generally walking our dog. Finally, 1 month later, the big one hit. Ray strolled into a local food store, high on that stuff he was making. He picked up a small child and tried to run. When the parents noticed, Ray dropped the child and tried to hide, but the police found him. He was fully released from jail a month later because the cells were too full. No transfers, nothing. It was like he was acquitted, although I'm not sure what of the outcome of the whole ordeal. If he was capable of kidnapping, would he have done that to me? What about my brother? Ray, I hope you overdose. I gave you a chance, and you gave me and my brother childhood trauma. I've had 3 occurrences that weirded me out when they occurred. The first thing that happened. I was living in a house that had vaulted ceilings in a sitting room of sorts, with large windows. There was a road that curved just before our house, so it wouldn't be unusual for headlights to fill the room at night. I had a friend over, and his mum was coming to pick him up. We had finished watching our movie, or whatever it was we were doing, and were sitting in that room waiting. We were sitting on a couch, with our backs to the windows, when I saw a bit of light above us. I looked out the window, expecting it to be his mum. Nothing. Strange, but nothing alarming. Then it happened again. I turned and looked out the windows again. No car. And my friend says, "You saw that too?" We both look up at the same time, and there's a ball of light dancing around the ceiling. Needless to say, we hauled ass out of there. The second thing that happened. My stepfather was a heavy snorer, and my mother a light sleeper. Because of this, I made a deal with my stepfather that we could switch off who was sleeping in my bed and who was sleeping on the couch. I liked it because it meant I was able to stay up really late watching HBO. Insert winky face. I specifically remember watching Blade 2 before turning off the TV one night. I saw a weird spot of light on the wall. I didn't think much of it. You see, that room with the vaulted ceilings also had a large mirror on one wall. If a car had been outside, the light could reflect off the mirror and go all the way to the room I was in now. This is what I assumed the light was, and I ignored it for some time. After turning the TV off, I noticed the light was still there. This was after maybe 30 minutes or so. For whatever reason, I thought it looked like a piece of paper pinned to the wall. It began to weird me out. So I took a pillow and kind of swung it between the wall and where the light was supposed to be coming from, to test if it was a reflection. The best way to describe what happened is this. You know, if you have something drawn on a whiteboard and you wipe it away with an eraser? Think that. But the shadow of the pillow was the eraser. It didn't disappear at once, but rather was wiped away. The third and creepiest thing. I was friends with a few guys in a youth group called Young Life. It's a pretty popular thing as far as I know. Some local wealthy people supported the local group and would often let us come and do activities on their vast property. This night, one guy had a lot of property with a massive orchard and was allowing us to play a game of flashlight tag, essentially hide and seek with a flashlight. For safety reasons, we were meant to be partnered up with someone else. My partner and I were one of 2 groups of seekers, and everyone went and hid. After a minute or 2, we looked for them. We were fairly deep into the orchard, as there was a road and a jeep that we had come in on the edge of the orchard. When we heard a shuffle about 20 feet in front of us, we tried to be sneaky, and he turned the flashlight off. I didn't have one, only he did. That's when my friend Matt, who was partnered with another Matt, jumped out of a bush and ran towards the road/jeep. My partner says, "Stay here and catch Matt," while he crashed out after the other Matt with the flashlight. I kept hearing shuffling, so I inched closer. "Matt? Come on, man, come out." Then I heard a twig snap directly behind me. Just like in the movies, I was expecting to turn around and see my friend. At first I thought I was looking at a stump, maybe 3 or 3.5 feet tall. It creeped me out though. Something wasn't right. Then I realized it had eyes. It was looking at me, and there was moonlight reflecting off its eyes. Maybe a raccoon. I tried to rationalize what I was looking at, but I couldn't. It was short, stubby, had eyes, and that was it. I freaked out and ran back to the Jeep. I waited there with Matt, who was apparently caught by my partner, and my partner, until the young life leader came back. Guys, I want to take a second to pray. Okay, why? What's up? He looked pretty shaken up. We were crossing that path over there and this thing, about this tall, he held up his hand about 3 or 4 feet, ran right in front of us. For a bit of background, I am a 15-year-old pasty white girl, measuring 5'5" and kind of thick. I live in America, somewhere up north, where literally nothing happens. I live in a house where my backyard and a park intermingle with each other. The park is just a long stretch of land to play frisbee golf and for people to go on walks and runs. So it is great for me and my 1-year-old German Shepherd puppy to walk and run around. This park / the main walking trail is horizontal to my house, and said house is up on a super steep hill, and tons of people visit this park all the time, all year round, and tons of people accidentally wander into our little backyard because of the frisbee golf trail. But what happened in this story does not align with any possible wholesome explanation. It was semi-late, probably right after 7 p.m, and I had just eaten dinner. My dad tells me to go walk the dog. His name is Sunny. And I begrudgingly obliged and got all my athletic stuff and the leash, and we were off. I'm used to the steep hill, but that doesn't mean I'm able to walk very gracefully down it. My dad is sitting on the porch doing whatever, while my dog, although 1 year old, is dragging me down the hill towards the main trail. I take note of a man in a grey hoodie getting out of his car in the parking lot to the far right of me and walking in the same direction as I am. My only thought is that I don't want to have to deal with Sunny freaking out, because he gets nervous around other people and dogs, so I am walking quickly to gain more distance between this man, and even though he is quite far back, he is in a grey hoodie, despite it being swelteringly hot, black shorts and sunglasses. I am not close enough to distinguish possible height, but he has the same body type and face, from what I can see, as famous American restaurateur Guy Fieri. Anyway, I am walking down the path and get to a fork in the road. There is one path you can take to the left, which is for the frisbee golfers, and one to the right, which is a steep incline of a dirt trail for hikers. Both paths are heavily wooded. The path to the left loops back around to the main trail, while the one on the right loops back much further away. Feeling just a little paranoid, and not wanting to die using this as a test to see if he's following me, / hoping to get rid of him so my dog will stop freaking out, I take the trail to the left. I get about halfway and stop to wait for him to keep walking down the main trail as I catch my breath, when I suddenly see something that makes everything about this park seem suddenly terrible. I see a flash of grey to the right of me, and the man has taken the same path as me, and he is seemingly close, seeing as how I have not heard a sound. Immediately I sprint in the opposite direction and stick to the edge of the river, because there are lots of trees there, and I am hoping I can be well hidden from him. Although looking back, I should have stayed out in the open on the path, so that more people could have seen me. I jogged the rest of the way home, which was not very far. I reach the backyard, and my dog has no idea what's going on, and neither does my dad, who has been there the whole time. I turn back around and suddenly have the urge to vomit when I watch him cross the bridge, and immediately upon seeing that I am with my dad, turn back around and walk towards the parking lot. There is no explanation as to why he, number one, followed me down the trail for frisbee golfers, because he didn't have any frisbee stuff with him. Number two, followed me into my backyard, because what? Now this guy knows where I live. I haven't seen him since. I hate being home alone, and while I do still walk my dog down that main trail, it has never been the same, and I always carry some kind of weapon. Yes, I told my dad, and I never walk alone with my dog unarmed anymore. Be careful, because I know that even if you think you're safe with your dog, that creep who followed me home didn't seem to give two shits that I had a giant German Shepherd with me. You never know. You really can never know. I don't really believe in most paranormal stuff. It interests me, but I'm always highly skeptical of any such claims. For that reason, I don't often like telling this story, because I feel like it kind of breaks my credibility as a rational mind. It just sounds too absurd. But I saw what I saw, whatever it was. So here it is. About 6 years ago, I had just moved to the southeastern United States. I loved it there. It was beautiful, and had such a deep, fascinating history. On this particular late afternoon, I was visiting an old plantation. It was an extraordinary place, a big mansion with massive grounds, and a lot of great historical artifacts from the 1800s. Plus, it was the middle of the week in mid-fall, so the place wasn't crowded at all. I wandered off on my own to explore the grounds. There were lots of nice trees and plants, but my eye caught a strange path off the edge of the property, and I decided to follow it, alone. I walked down the path to find this weird, almost cave-like structure. It was surrounded by fallen leaves, and not nearly as beautiful as the rest of the property. I walked up to the locked metal gate, used as a door on this structure, and looked in. It was completely empty. Such a big open space. I figured that it must have been used for storage or something. It was just incredibly dark and empty there, especially as the late afternoon sun had started to go down. At this moment, my stomach churned over as a strange figure appeared. It was vaguely human in shape. By that, I mean it was human in height, but had a distinctive head-to-body ratio, and had an almost walking-like movement to it, though no clear limbs or anything. It was like someone had thrown a sheet over a walking person. You could see the movements, but not the detail. It also seemed very out of focus compared to its surroundings. The most incredible element was its color. It was a glowing blackness, despite that making no sense. It was almost illuminating the room in its vibrant blackness. I don't know how to describe it better than that. I believe it had a slightly purple glow around the edges as well. It walked out of the shadows on the left side of the room, through the lit area, and into the shadows on the right side of the room. It took a few seconds. It wasn't gone in a flash. It was quick, but long enough for me to really stand there and get a good look. I stood there in shock, not because I was scared or because I thought it was a ghost, but because my mind just could not comprehend what I was seeing. It was unlike anything I've ever seen. In the few brief moments that I watched the figure, my mind raced to explain what it was. My first thought was that it was a shadow. But the way it moved and gallowed, the way it was clearly standing in the middle of the room and not flat against a wall, all that disproved the shadow theory to me. My second, more likely theory was that there was something that was wrong with my eye. Some sort of temporary blindness at the center of my vision. But if this were the case, the figure would be overlaid onto all that I was seeing. But it wasn't. This theory was disproved by the fact that I watched the figure clearly walk behind the columns. It moved behind them, in one side and out the other, just like as if a person were doing so. This gave the figure a real and definite position in the room. For this reason, I concluded that the figure was either something that was really in the room or a hallucination, but an intelligent one. My brain specifically compensated for the figure's apparent pathways and adjusted my vision to see it move in and out of view as it was blocked by the columns and the bars on the gated door. When the figure vanished, I waited a moment and then turned and walked back to find my family. I didn't run, I walked quickly. As I was walking back up the path, I noticed a small sign covered in leaves. I walked over to it, brushed it off, and read it. It turned out the strange cave-like structure that I had assumed was originally storage was actually the family mausoleum. The bodies were relocated when the property was converted into a museum. 3 nights ago, on January 25th, I just got off work and my homeboy Din was waiting for me. So we headed to a park named Oakland Park, where we went to smoke. We parked on the opposite side of the lake, since the other side gets a lot more car traffic, which means more police, even late at night. Keep in mind, it's about 1:20 AM right now. We started to smoke, and we're just chilling in my car listening to music and talking, and I was looking to my left. I heard a faint woman scream, like a woman in her 20s. I asked him if he heard it, and he responded, "Nah, what are you talking about?" So I just thought to myself, perhaps I'm tripping. So we kept the sesh going, and I looked to my left again, and I see a truck parked in the other parking lot. I didn't think much of it, because this park is kind of known for being a spot to smoke. There's this sort of hill and house. It's more like a fireplace with a roof and tables to eat and have a cookout. Well, down near that hill, where Din and I are parked, I saw a man with a beanie. Again, I didn't think much of it for the same reason. I thought to myself, oh, that truck's probably waiting for him. But the truck left as soon as I thought of that. That seemed odd to me, but I didn't pay it any mind. The man started to walk up the hill and go to the parking lot. He was wearing a backpack, and I felt like I saw something in his hand, but I was pretty high, and my vision is mediocre, so I couldn't tell. So he kept walking up the path, and he turned to look at me, and I just kept looking at him. He looked like a normal person. As you walk up the path, you have to take a left to get to the parking lot, and there are a few trees. But there was this thicker tree, and as he walked past it, he didn't reappear. He disappeared. It tripped me out bad. It took a minute to process, but I asked Din if he saw him disappear. He said that he didn't. I was kind of freaking out inside. I spoke to him, telling him, "Bro, I saw him. He just disappeared." I was looking at him 100% of the time. My friend told me to stop, that I was making him scared now. And after about 3 minutes of thinking, we decided to leave it because of how scared we were. And we found no signs of him driving off. 2 nights ago, on Saturday, January 26th. So it's Din, my 2 co-workers Eduardo and Gerardo, and myself. We went to the same park to smoke around midnight, and to be honest, I had kind of forgotten about what happened the previous time we came. We started to smoke, and I had music playing, and we were just doing the same thing as the last trip. This time though, 2 cars were in front of us to the left, and I'm pretty sure they did a drug deal, and then they left. I didn't think anything of it. People come here to smoke all the time. So I told Eduardo and Gerardo this story about what happened. We all got pretty tensed up, and then Din told his paranormal experience in Vietnam when he was younger. But that's for another time. After we said the stories, we kept the sesh going and just started listening to music and kept talking about other stuff. I, for some reason, jogged my head up and looked to my left. We parked in the same spot as the previous night. I see nothing and just continued chilling. But a few minutes later, I heard the same woman scream, but louder and more clearly. I quickly turned to Din and asked him if he heard it. He replied, "Yeah, bro, you were right." I tell everyone immediately, "Dip, dip, dip." My friends got off their cars, got into theirs, and we all left. I couldn't stop shaking while driving Din home, and I was really messed up. I've never been so scared in my life. I felt like I've seen something that will never leave my mind. The next day, I said that I was never going to the park again, and Eduardo asks me today at work, "Hey, why did we leave yesterday? Was it because of the police sirens?" "Nah. Do you remember about that scream that I told you about, and so did Din?" He replies, "I did hear something faint, but I didn't think it was anything." Gerardo comes and basically says the same thing, but he's convinced he heard it, and he got scared like us. This just happened, and I'm still not sure if I wasn't tripping by accident. I'd just come out of the gym, and like always I decided to smoke a cigarette before getting on the subway. I generally do this because I love how futile it is attempting to being healthy, while also having a smoking habit. It's a rainy day, and there's practically no one outside. I turn my back to the door as I attempt to light my cigarette. The door behind me was pushed open. I don't turn back. I heard footsteps coming in my direction, and then stopping. I get that gut feeling that only happens when you subconsciously pick up that something is amiss, and amiss something was. I turned my eyes ever so slightly to my left to realize an elderly gentleman is standing just a few centimeters away from me. This poor guy looked like a wreck, and I'm well familiar with wrecks. He seemed like what would happen if the Crypt Keeper and Freddy Krueger had a love child which they promptly locked in the basement over how repugnant he looked. His eyes were sunken. Half of his hair had fallen out in random spots. His skin was so spotty that Cruella de Vil might want to jack it out of him. I realized then that Mange Jeffrey Dahmer was mouthing something in a very raspy and hissy voice. He seemed to have a lot of trouble breathing. "My lighter. I can't find my lighter." I offered him mine. "Do you need a lighter?" I asked, attempting to sound somewhat cold and aloof, but instead coming off as the chirpiest fella off the Disney cartoons. He refused. I stepped back to gain some distance from him. All the while, this guy's eyes are on my face. I can feel them, even if I'm not looking at them. I decided to gain some more distance between us and move all the way to the opposite end of the street. Like the millennial I am, my eyes were glued to my phone. I look up, realizing again that something was wrong. This forceless Darth Vader was nearly on top of me again. I almost jumped out of my wet boots. This guy was closer to me physically than my father has ever been emotionally. I stay silent, eyeing him, trying to figure out his next move. "I'll call you God," he wheezed. "Excuse me?" I asked, certain that my ears were more treacherous than the Slavic girl from MySpace that asked for your credit card numbers in '08. "That's what a father calls a son. You're my son, aren't you?" he struggled to say. I nod affirmatively negatively. "Then you are the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost." Holy ghosting on Tinder, Batman. This guy was obviously off. I take a few steps back as he blithers in both Portuguese and English about God and a son. I was pretty sure this was the scene where he'd pull a knife and stab me through the jugular as O Fortuna played in the background. Since my survival skills are nil, I did what every 20-something-year-old does when threatened. I retreated into my phone's world. He huffed and puffed about God, me, the Son, the Holy Spirit, and all that other stuff. I couldn't hear, nor did I want to. Finally, he asks, "Are you there, God?" Without breaking visual contact with my phone, I answer, "No." He begins to walk back, still staring at me, mumbling something under the warm blanket of his strained breaths. Finally, he leaves, just as he has entered, and leaving me even more confused than I already was. Am I unknowingly some reincarnation of a junkie god messiah? Jesus. Pay a guy a drink before creating a cult around him. Am I right, boys? When I was about 15, my friend James had ridden his bike over to my house on a school night for a quick visit. It was pure daylight when James first turned up, and it was only the two of us and my older sister, who was about 18 at the time, at home. When James turned up, I heard the knock on the door and eagerly opened it up, asking him, "Dude, why is there an old woman in your front yard?" I looked behind him. There was nothing. Must have just left, that's weird. We go on with our night, and I don't think anything of it. About an hour or two pass, and my back door opens. It's just a normal old door, so if it's unlocked, the wind is able to open it. My small dog runs in, shivering because it's freezing outside. I feel bad, but she's an absolute mess playing in the mud. I set up her kennel real quick outside to be good for her, pop her in, run back inside, and lock and close the door. It happened again. Must have not locked the door. Rinse and repeat. Pop Monty in her kennel, lock the door, and make absolutely sure I lock it. It happens again. I'm infuriated with my crappy quality door right now. I lock it, and it doesn't happen again. After a few more hours, the two of us not thinking that anything strange is happening just yet, James decides to leave. As we were walking to my door, it's about a 6 to 7 meter corridor, only a door at the end. I have a key in the knob with a bunch of keys hanging off it, and the keys started to swing wildly. Again, I pass it off as just wind. James, though, not so much. He has the ride home in the pitch black, pissing down with rain and unheard of winds. We get to the door, and I put the keys to a straight stop from the crazy swinging, when James isn't looking. "Oh my God, mate, they just stopped," I said. James is freaking out and looks away. I bash them to get them swinging again, and I mean really swinging. "What's happening?" I exclaim, trying to freak him out. They came straight to a halt. I start freaking out at this point, and immediately my phone rings. It's my mum. She doesn't even say hello, and starts saying, she doesn't even say hello. She starts by saying, "Strange question, but by any chance has weird stuff been happening at home?" Right now, I'm thinking, shit, what's up? I tell her what happened, and then Mum tells me the first thing, which isn't too bad. "Well, Linda," she started, Mum's sister. "She's been having little things at home. She has a barometer, and the dial just got ripped off. Sean went to the garage to get a wrench to put it back on, and the transistor radio flew across the garage. I'm beginning to want James to not leave me just yet. He's bolted the barometer hand back on, and it got ripped off too." Now Mum goes on to her second part. That part got me. Now I got a voicemail. Don't get a call, just straight to voicemail. Now before I go on about the voicemail, I never heard it, but she said it happened, and it deleted itself, and I believed her because of the ending. Also, it's relevant that we live in Australia, and my mother's Irish, so anyone that calls normally has an Australian accent. It's kind of like white noise, with a really faint voice. My mother's mother has been passed away for a little while at this point. It sounds like my mum singing a nursery rhyme she made up when we were children. Only her immediate family would know the words. No one is saying they did it. After a little while of my 15-year-old self freaking out to my mum over the phone, we finish the call. I come up with an idea. I was given a bookmark from my grandma's funeral when my mum went over for it that had a photo of her and the date of her death. I showed it to James. "Dude, that's the woman who was on your front yard." It was her 5-year death anniversary that day. Each year around this time, I open up my Time Hop app, and I am reminded of a night 3 years ago. Photos of softball-size black and blue bruises all over the right side of my body come up. I'm honestly somewhat thankful for that, because it could have been much worse. I'll just never know. 3 years ago, after a blackout Wednesday night with friends, I found myself locked out of my partner at the time's apartment at 3 a.m. She was out with co-workers doing the same thing. Her serving shift ended. We live in a big city, so I'd taken the train from where the night ended with my friends straight to her place, and decided I'd just wait for her rather than head back home, as the commute would be another half hour or so, and my phone was dying. I was honestly just ready to sleep. In hindsight, I obviously just should have headed to my own apartment that night. After multiple texts and phone calls from her to come home, my partner, being thoroughly annoyed with me, was not in any rush to end her night. Drunk and upset, I sat at the entrance of the gates of her apartment community and sulked. It was raining and cold, and I was exhausted. Putting myself in this situation alone was my parents' worst nightmare. But at this point my phone was dead. I didn't have enough cab money, and there was no way in hell I was walking 15 minutes back to the train to head to my own apartment. A few minutes later, a man in a ski mask, sunglasses, and an oversized parka walks up to me. I remember him so vividly asking if I was okay. I responded that I was fine, and to please stay away from me. I gave him the benefit of the doubt. I thought for a split second he was genuinely concerned. I mean, here I was, a college-aged girl, sitting outside in the rain at 3 a.m. completely alone. But at 3 a.m, you don't just approach a girl dressed like that and mean no harm. He then brandished an X-Acto knife, and then asked, "Are you sure you're okay?" He picked me up with one hand while striking at the back of my hood with the knife. All I could do was scream. I know I asked him why he was doing that, but I couldn't even bring myself to pull out the mace in my coat pocket. I was so stunned. Talk about fight, flight, or freeze. I don't know what it was, if it was a car that drove by, or my screaming that caused him to stop. But after the longest 30 or so seconds of my life, he threw me to the ground and ran, leaving me with those awful aforementioned bruises. I'll be forever grateful for the thick hood of my coat that came away with some knife cuts. Had my hood not been up, he would have absolutely sliced the back of my neck and head. My partner pulled up in a cab a few minutes later. At least, I think it was a few minutes later. It was really a blur. I definitely went into a state of shock. We called 911 from her charged phone, and I stayed awake for the police to come and take a report, but didn't hear much else afterwards. There was a decent amount of crime in my city, so I wasn't really expecting much to come of it. What scares me the most was that 1, I still don't know what the man wanted. 2, he knows what I look like, and I have absolutely no idea what he looks like. 3, I'm pretty certain I was followed all the way from the transit station to the apartment complex, which was a fairly long walk. Those 3 reasons still give me chills. Ski Mask Man, let's not meet again.